We know that they want us to be tied into a digital population control grid, as James Corbett has described it, with the health passports. You won't be able to go anywhere unless they tell you that you're healthy or not. And in fact, there was something that he mentioned in one of his recent videos on the Great Reset. It's a 72-minute video that he made, and it's well worth watching. But I did want to bring up something. Because we're constantly told how everything's going to change and automation is coming in, largely because of social distancing. Actually, that's what social distancing was designed to do, to make human contact and therefore human productivity virtually impossible, but and therefore break down industries and force the acceleration of automation. But there was an article back in March 20th, 2020 of this year, and it's on the Financial Times. Yuval Noah Harari, The World After Coronavirus. And again, it's one of these kinds of articles that you and I went through in the beginning of this, way back in March, April, when suddenly they were just telling us how the world was going to be very suspiciously. And I wanted to read a passage from this because it ties into something that Dan Andrews has recently said in Premier Victoria. And so this article, it says, the emergency pudding. One of the problems we face in working out where we stand on surveillance, and we know that we're going to have more technology, more surveillance around us and potentially in our bodies, is that none of us know exactly how we are being surveilled and what the coming years might bring. Surveillance technology is developing at breakneck speed, and what seemed science fiction 10 years ago is today old news. And this is what, again, James, a few people, actually, Catherine Austin Fitz, when she was talking to Alex Jones recently, was saying the thing that people have to grapple with, John, is the fact that they have technology now that is almost like magic. We actually have to realize they have incredible technologies. As a thought experiment, consider a hypothetical government that demands that every citizen wears a biometric bracelet that monitors body temperature and heart rate 24 hours a day. This is not going to sound so crazy when I play this clip from Dan Andrews in a moment. The resulting data is hoarded and analyzed by government algorithms. The algorithms will know that you are sick even before you know it. And they will also know where you have been and who you have met. The chains of infection would be drastically shortened. So this would be a recipe for absolute control at any time. You could flip a switch and go, sorry, John, I know you were planning to go for a walk today, but that's not going to happen because you're sick and you don't even realize you're sick. But that's what we've set as a precedent. People who are healthy are being told that they're sick when they're not. And now everybody who's healthy believes that other healthy people are potentially sick. Therefore, we have to wear a mask and keep away from each other. So the real virus, John, the real illness, the mental illness is this humophobia that everybody has now of each other, and this germophobia, and even cut all together. So such a system could arguably stop the epidemic in its tracks within days. Sounds wonderful, right? No, it sounds awful. This downside is, of course, let's just trust the human immune system instead. How about that? Instead of a technocracy. The downside is, of course, that this would give legitimacy to a terrifying new surveillance system. If you know, for example, that I clicked on Fox News link rather than a CNN link, then you can that can teach you something about my political views and perhaps even my personality. But if you can monitor what happens to my body temperature, blood pressure, and heart rate as I watch the video clip, you can learn what makes me laugh, what makes me cry, what makes me really, really angry. It is crucial to remember that anger, joy, boredom, love are biological phenomenon, just like fever and a cough. The same technology that identifies coughs could also identify laughs. If corporations and governments start harvesting our biometric data en masse, they can get to know us far better than we know ourselves, and they can, which is what they've always wanted, I suppose, is absolute slavery, and they can then not just predict our feelings, but also manipulate our feelings and sell us anything they want, be it a product or a politician. Biometric monitoring could make Cambridge Analytica's data hacking tactics look like something from the Stone Age. Imagine North Korea in 2030, where every citizen has to wear a biometric bracelet 24 hours a day. If you listen to a speech by the great leader and the bracelet picks up the telltale signs of anger, you are done for. And what I wanted to play with you, I know I've gone off here now a bit, but what I wanted to play for you was a clip by Dan Andrews, and he's talking about people travelling into the country. Let's just listen to this for a second.
Interpret the Prime Minister to be saying, and I'm sure if I'm not accurate, somebody will point that out, that the notion that everyone who returns from everywhere goes into 14 days of a hotel, that may not be the policy going forward as we look to the entirety of 2021, for instance, not knowing when a vaccine turns up. then mean that you've got options. And one of those options might be to say to people, and other countries in the world are doing this, here is an electronic device that means we can be certain about where you are, but there is some technology that can actually monitor your vital signs as well, so it becomes something that's not just to ensure you stay where you're supposed to stay, it's also a way in which we can monitor whether you're healthy or otherwise.
That kind of reminded me of something that Klaus Schwab said about the fourth industrial revolution.
What the fourth industrial revolution will lead to is a fusion of our physical, our digital, and our biological identities.
It's really amazing, John, that during this so-called crisis, that suddenly all of these amazing technologies that are supposed to be permanent in our lives have just emerged, almost like a trap has been set and was actually developed long before 2020.
Well, this is something that just strikes me now, that, you know, I grew up, you grew up, you're a lot younger than I am, but I lived through a time of, you know, when we were reaching kind of like the acme of democratic life, you know, that the ideals of democracy and freedom and the rule of law were kind of reaching their we're in a crescendo, as it were. Not necessarily, you know, we would have imagined terminal in any way, but never that we were really striving, and that was, in a certain sense, a form of perfecting our political lives, our civil lives. It never dawned on us for a moment that while all those values were being espoused by political figures, by cultural figures, and I'm really being quite blank now because I'm talking, you know, the people who are indicted on the indictment warrants here, the names are not just politicians and scientists and medics and all the rest of it, you know, COVID czars. It's also artists who are silent, journalists who are complicit, all of these people, editors who are criminals. So all these people who had these discussions all our lives, and we were taken in by them, it never occurred to us for a moment that their commitment to democracy may have been to do with a deficiency of opportunity to do something else. And it's a little bit like, you know, that kind of old gag we used to tell about the Irish being in the past being non-materialistic. Well, you know, that was because we had no money, right? So it was easy to be non-materialistic when you had no money, and you turn it into a virtue and a philosophy. And in the same way, it seems now that what we're actually seeing unfold is that actually all of this palaver about democracy was simply the same thing, that the opportunity to actually introduce tyranny effectively, you know, there was just too much trouble to have to kind of round people up and put them in gas chambers. You know, that these people who were supposedly the great idealists, the great artists, the great writers, the great politicians, the great leaders, were actually just waiting around so they could be part of the greatest tyranny that ever was. That's what we're now facing. This is staggering. You know, this is something that really astonishes me, because if what we're seeing is true, and there's very little doubt about it now, very little doubt. I wish there were more. I wish there was kind of some uncertainty. But we've traveled this route now for 6, 7 months, 8 months nearly, watching this, starting from the beginning, as we said, buying in, going along, then starting to questions, then investigating, then confirming, consolidating, and then it deepens. And I look back over my life as a journalist, you know, and you know, I'm a member of, you know, as I said, I was a priest of the Fourth Estate. That's what I saw my role as functionally, you know, if that doesn't sound too pretentious or portentous. But that's kind of what it was. As Edmund Burke said, you know, in the House of Commons in 1787, Edmund Burke, the great Irish philosopher, he said that this was the day that the press came into the House of Commons for the first time. And he talked about the three estates of the realm, the clerical lords, the secular lords, and the House of Commons. And then he gestured to the press benches, which had just been opened. He says, and there sits the Fourth Estate, the most powerful of them all. And that was like the flying buttress of democracy, which supported it by virtue of opening it up to scrutiny and to transparency and to interrogation by the people. And we were the priests of that process. And I look back at my life now, Dave, when I started out in journalism really in 1981. and I was still down in County Roscommon. I was driving a mail car, which is kind of like a stagecoach, which delivered mails and newspapers around. I was delivering newspapers to the adjoining villages and towns. And I've often said, I mean, when I've told this little story in the recent years, that when I ceased to deliver them and I went to Dublin to work for Hot Press. My little niece, Elaine, who's getting married next week, God bless her, she said to me, John, which do you prefer, delivering the newspapers or writing in them? And at the time, that seemed like an hilarious question, because obviously you want to be a trendy journalist. But now I think of those days. My father, I mean, he was so scrupulous about those bales of newspaper. It's like they were sacred documents. Like if there was one missing, he would count them and check the label and write on the label to the news agent, paper missing at the station. And like it was like that we were carrying bulletins from the center, from the intelligence of our democracy, out spreading it around the countryside to the people, so that John McGahern, the novelist, who lived in Coot Hall in Roscommon, would have his Irish Times in the morning when he got out of bed. That the parish priest in Elphin would have his newspaper. They wouldn't even have to think about it. It would be on the doormat because we had been up at 4 o'clock. But then, so it was seen as an absurd question in a way, because it is a kind of a menial job, but it actually had great dignity, and we were kind of like the king, the equivalent of the king's messengers, going to it, riding on our white chargers to the kingdom in the night. And now I say there was more dignity in that than being a journalist. Journalism has become the professional telling of lies. They are journaliers now, not journalists.
Because we've been hit continuously by various Hegelian dialectics, one after the other. A problem is manufactured, we react, and then wouldn't you know, there's a solution offered. And it's all down to how carefully the temperature of the boiling pot is managed as it's brought up to the boil. That's what I found, John, is that you can say to people now, well, let's take that Canada leak. Is it possible that more and more private property would fall into the hands of large banksters and will be taken from people? I mean, this is certainly what communists want, and if they're truly as hideously totalitarian as we believe they may be, of course they would. And people right now would say, they'll never do that. That would never happen. This will never be accepted. People would never accept having to use an app or some sort of device on their arm or in their phone, or an app on their phone or in their body for that matter. Well, it's a slow process. It's a slow burn. And eventually people get there, and people don't even realize the hardest thing is to say something like, because it's very hard to prove to somebody, well, retroactively, if I was to bring you back to, you say this is the person wearing the mask and washing their hands obsessively and believing everything and going along with this new normal, despite the fact that they've no rights, and accepting that we have police checkpoints, accepting restrictions on your movements, accepting all of these things, and this terrible loss of life, loss of social life, loss of joy, loss of hobbies, loss of everything that makes life worth living, and all the coping mechanisms and socializing. And you'd say, well, if I took you back to January of this year or last year or something, you would have told me that all the things that you have now accepted would have been ridiculous. But you can't do that looking back, because people, I remember Steve Jobs said that, and he, so you can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them back looking back. But you can't really, in this case, convince somebody of what they may have rejected in the past when they've accepted it now. That's really the difficult thing. And all you can do is tell them such and such a thing is coming down the line. Come back to me in March or April or May or sometime in 2021 and see what else that you will have accepted then that you're currently telling me now you would never have accepted.
Well, you see, this is the question, Dave. Do people have a breaking point? Do they have a point where they scrub the blackboard and say, no, nothing of that makes sense now. I'm going to have to go back to first principles here. And I understand the process you're talking about. And I understand that, for example, take the property issue. Look how cleverly and cynically they've constructed the conditions to make actually possibly popular among sections of the population, the idea of transferring wealth to the state and then treating everybody as equally, poverty stricken. Because they've created conditions over several decades now where young people are unable to afford their own home in the way that we were in the beginning. We had a chance. I mean, when it wasn't easy, but 30 years ago, you had a chance if you could get together 10 grand of a deposit and get yourself a decent job to pay a mortgage, you could get a house. Now that's out of the reach of people, of young people, even with good jobs. So they've created that. That is not a spontaneous, naturalistic phenomenon. That's actually an engineered situation. Precisely, it seems now quite obvious to this end that they will be able then to gain political support for the sequestration, for the confiscation of property.
Yeah, in other words, get people to value, well, you've a roof over your head, you don't own it and you never loan it, but, that sort of thing. And then, of course, I think as well, the introduction of property taxes are a big part of that because they're designed to be increased, and which is that effectively the state owns your property and is merely the landlord leasing it back to you. If you've paid off your mortgage, say for example, and you have the deed and you should be the homeowner, your house should not cost you anything more than the basic running of it, I suppose. But there's this continuous charge that can build up over time. And the plan there, obviously, one of the ways that they might start to strip, and this is just me, speculating here, but to strip people who actually own property outright with no mortgage, to strip them of their home might be to say, well, when we crash the currency that you're using, you'll have to make use of this new digital cashless currency, whatever it'll be. And in order to get into that and to get onto the new economic system, you're going to have to do the vaccine. It'll be no jab, no pay. Otherwise, we no longer recognize the old currency, or they'll just increase the property taxes well beyond the universal basic income that they're paying you per month, which means that you can't pay it anyway. And at that stage, they de facto own your property anyway, or they can certainly kick you out of it if you can't pay the charges.
Yeah, but you see, okay, having gone through all that, and I mean, I take on board a lot of that, and I understand it. However, I keep coming back to this thing. I come from a rock and roll place, right? And the spirit of rock and roll, if it is about anything, is opposed to tyranny, first and foremost. It doesn't put a name on that tyranny. It just says it is against tyranny. It grew out of the experience of slavery, which, collided with the experience of Irish immigrants fleeing starvation in their own land in the form of what became country music. And that was the collision that happened in Sam Phillips' back room with Elvis Presley singing those first songs on tape in 1953. Now, the whole point of that, whatever you called yourself, whatever stripe you put on your jacket, you were against tyranny. And here it is. It's knocking. It's at the door. So I'm asking people now who are like in the world, the artists, Madonna, Bono, the novelists, Ian McEwan, Don DeLillo, where do you stand now that the tanks are on the streets? Where do you stand? Is it time to end the bullshit? Is it time to say it doesn't matter whether you call yourself left or right? This is tyranny by any name. By any name, this is tyranny. Can we deal with that and stop calling each other names and try to actually, even at this stage, to come forward onto the public stage and speak against this?